Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Zara Gobai, and I'm the Global Community Engagement Manager here at Copperleaf, and I'm going to be serving as your host for today's session. So today, I'm really excited to be joined by Boudewijn Neijens and Kim Knickle, who are going to discuss how and why the ESG disclosures landscape is evolving, and what organizations like yours can do to turn your aspirational goals into actionable operational plans, and of course, report on increasingly important ESG-driven, the mouthful, business outcomes. And for a little bit of background before we get going here, our speakers. So Kim Knickle is Research Director for ESG and Sustainability at Verdantix. Kim is an industry subject matter expert, thought leader, and storyteller. And she's all about making it easier to drive business value from the use of technology. So Kim, welcome.
Thank you.
Also have Boudewijn Neijens here, who's the Chief Marketing Officer at Copperleaf, but he's also a board member of the IAM, which is the Institute of Asset Management, an international organization, and is not only the chair of the Canadian Committees for Asset Management at ISO, but is also part of the ESG Strategic Advisory Group at ISO, which is really exciting. So welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for being here. And Boudewijn, I'm going to pass it over to you to get us going.
Excellent. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. The agenda today, we're going to very quickly first kind of frame what we're going to talk about. So, what is ESG? For those of you who might not spend their days obsessing about it, then I'll turn it over to Kim, and she will talk a bit about the growing need to disclose what you're doing in ESG and the formal reporting that comes with it, both today and especially how it's going to evolve into the future. There's a lot going on there. Then I will come back and talk a bit about how this connects up with our daily lives, and in particular, of course, with asset management, which actually has strong parallels with ESG. And therefore, where can it help us on our ESG journey? And then, as Zara said, we'll open it up for questions. So with that being said, very quickly, therefore, what is ESG? There's no official definition. So what I'm putting up here is my interpretation, and you're free to argue with it, and we can kind of dive deeper into it later on. But fundamentally, it's three key drivers that are kind of starting to become more and more important in the setting of the strategy of your organization. Environmental goals, of course, which have been with us for a little while now, maybe a couple of decades. So it's effectively how the company acts towards the planet. B, social, so how it treats its employees, customers, etc. And then 3, governance, the governance of the organization itself, effectively how are you running your company. And you could argue that just by way of example, because these lists are definitely not complete or kind of exhaustive, these are the kind of things that you would typically find under those 3 headings, and that you would therefore need to drive towards and also report on, as we'll see later. And typically you want to focus, of course, on the matters that actually are material to your organization. So what we've seen as an evolution, effectively, within many organizations, is this goal of widening the goals of the organization. You start off with effectively having primarily financial goals, essentially be profitable, kind of generate money for your shareholders. And more we're moving to something which is, what some people call stakeholder capitalism, which is much more driven by the impact that the organization is making altogether. So not only financially, but also on the economy at large, the environment, and for people, basically, right? And of course, with that comes the need to actually report on what you're doing in this particular context. And that comes largely from the fact that there's a lot of greenwashing going on. In other words, people talk, but there is no action. And in order to overcome that, clearly the only way to fix that is to kind of hold people accountable, which means reporting. And that is where I'm going to hand it over to Kim, who's going to tell us exactly how we fix this problem.
Excellent. Thanks, Boudewijn. Great. Well, let me jump right into this. Of course, we have a disclaimer slide, but what we're talking about today, from my perspective, is about understanding the disclosures and reporting landscape in order to be ready for all of these changes that are coming. Inevitably, when we start talking about disclosures and reporting, we ultimately get to that point that we need the data. Where do we find the data? Is it the right quality? So I'm going to talk a little bit about investor grade ESG and sustainability data. And then, there's no point in having data and information and analysis in a vacuum. And so I also want to be conscious of where that information is coming from across the organization, as well as how can that information or how should that information be shared across the organization, and give you some ideas there. So the first thing I want to do is share some data that we have from our 2021 corporate survey. It's a global survey of 400 respondents. And we asked in the last 12 months, how significant have the following drivers been in terms of your firm's engagement with sustainability issues? And what I want to draw your attention to is that top response, having the most significant and very significant responses among the set. And it's climate change policy development. Whichever region you're in, whichever jurisdiction, it's not only the climate change policies that are put into place, but the ones that we anticipate coming that we also have to respond to and prepare for. And so I think, part of this conversation today is because we know that change is coming. We don't know exactly what change, and it takes time to prepare for that change. And so we want to make sure that you're moving forward as soon as possible, because we know there will be some change. We don't always know exactly what it will be. I do want to point out the second most common response we received was around ESG ratings impacting investor discussions. And so in addition to this regulated piece, climate change policies, we also have to consider what the financial market is doing. And that's true regardless of whether you're a public or a private company, because it will first apply to the publicly listed companies, but it will spread out into all companies in order to get access to capital, not just, what your market cap is on the stock exchange. So let's start with the way that I look at the disclosures in terms of three different categories. We have the ones that are purely voluntary, and so exactly what it is, it's optional, and we do see that those are most common among publicly listed firms that are very large, with more than $1 billion of revenue. The second bucket is mandatory and regulated, and I've put them together because although some may not be regulations per se, they become mandatory because of demands in the market. So that may be something, for example, that your customer mandates, or it could be the market as a whole or a specific stakeholder. And then there is the uncontrolled disclosures. And so what I mean there is information that is not necessarily made available through your deliberate release. So and I'm using the term issuer to mean the company that the data is about. So let's take a look at some examples here. And this is, there are a lot of abbreviations here. It is definitely an alphabet soup. And so I've put quite a few of the abbreviations on the bottom of the page here for you. But for the most part, people don't say the full, like I would never say Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. Instead, I would say SASB. So just a language comment there. So under voluntary, you see that I have TCFD, GRI, and SASB, some voluntary stock exchange reporting, and then some low impact voluntary ESG questionnaire. So let me just focus in on the TCFD, GRI, and SASB for a second. So TCFD is essentially a framework to help public companies and others disclose climate-related risks and opportunities. So Boudewijn, when you started, you talked about value creation and impact driven types of decisions. And so I want to make sure that we also add risk to that list. So risk is definitely a part of a lot of these voluntary requirements. TCFD, as I said, is mostly voluntary, but we'll talk about that a little bit on the next slide. But you also see it here under mandatory and regulated, and that's because it has quite a few supporters, and one of the supporters is the UK government. So I'll come back to that point. GRI and SASB, they are often seen as doing the same thing, doing the same job, but they're somewhat complementary. GRI is definitely global. You can find GRI information online at globalreporting.org. And with SASB, also online, lots of great info, sasb.org. It gets more sector specific, so industry sector specific, and also lots of good information in terms of understanding materiality. So what's relevant here when we talk about ESG and sustainability? So I encourage you to look at those websites and to get more information. Under the mandatory and regulated, for ESG questionnaires, I have CDP and GRESB. We say GRESB. So CDP, also a wealth of information. One of the most common questionnaires that corporates have used, and I put it under the mandatory because so many institutions, investors, stakeholders expect you to meet the CDP questionnaire. GRESB has been traditionally more real estate focused, and so if you're in the real estate market in some way, you'd probably have to fill out that questionnaire. They have expanded that slightly to include real assets is the term that they're using. So worth checking out, probably one that you're not hearing as much about. So TCFD, GRI, SASB, CDP, I highly recommend that you start tracking them and what the expectations are there. There are some stock exchange listing requirements that we use the term comply or explain. And so this again is a request for information about your ESG and sustainability performance. Disclosure related to getting access to capital is something that is becoming increasingly mandatory. TCFD, as I said, is moving to being mandatory in more jurisdictions, starting with the UK. And then there are quite a few regulations or kind of mandatory requirements in place for financial institutions. And when a financial institution has to comply with something like the SFDR, which is in the EU, that then means they place in expectations on the companies that they invest in or the companies that want to access capital within those institutions. So that's why I bring that up here. Under the uncontrolled, I just have a few examples, some things to consider that social media, there are trackers of ESG sentiment online. There are an increasing number of trackers that are satellite based, that are making judgments, is probably the right way to think of it, judgments on the risk for specific locations and even specific assets. So something I also recommend that you keep an eye on. So let me get to the slide that we could probably take 3 hours on, but I'm not going to do that. So I'm just going to look at this as something to get you started here. So in 2021, we didn't see much in the way of moving into the mandatory or regulated category. However, we do see that the progress is being made with things like TCFD becoming let's see, I want to say this the right way, UK deciding that TCFD should become mandatory. And I believe that as of April, we're going to start seeing some of those requirements become required. Let me see. Just checking my notes here. There's so many details to keep track of. So the other thing to keep in mind here is that the G20, so in other words, the global 20 countries, have all indicated that they support TCFD. So while the UK is the first one to set a date for it being mandatory, I believe we can expect that all of the countries in the G20 will institute some level of mandatory requirements related to the TCFD framework. So the number of supporters for TCFD have been growing very rapidly. The other thing that the G20 has also publicly supported is the IFRS and the creation of the ISSB. Now, I apologize, I didn't spell those out on this page here, but for the most part, you will never see those acronyms spelled out. You can pretty much do a search for IFRS and ISSB, and it'll come up very easily. So the Boudewijn, you have a great logo representing how we've gotten to the ISSB, and I'm sorry I don't have that on the slide right now, but let me just, this is a little bit of a scary alphabet soup. It brings together Integrated Reporting, SASB, Value Reporting Foundation, Climate Disclosure Standards Board, and the IFRS to launch the ISSB. And essentially what it is all about sustainable finance. So that the ISSB has released some prototype disclosures, and those are related to climate and general sustainability disclosure requirements. Now they incorporate TCFD and SASB. So again, you're hearing some familiar names. So absolutely one more reason why you should keep track of TCFD and SASB. Now, to look at the looking at the 2022 list, I mentioned SFDR. So that is for the EU. The level 1 has been introduced. That's more relevant to financial institutions. And I said that when financial institutions are required to do something, they're going to look at the companies that they're investing in and want the information to be available. That's essentially what the CSR directive is doing. And then next, I have a reference to the EU taxonomy. This is something that I don't have a finance background, nor do I have an accounting background. It took me some time to really get my arms around in terms of the meaning. Basically, the EU taxonomy is creating a language, and companies will need to indicate how their OPEX, CAPEX, and revenue or turnover, depending on where you are, what language you use, meets the taxonomy. And that's going to give, again, investors and other stakeholders a common language to understand how much progress you're making in ESG and sustainability. Now, obviously, there's a lot more to it than that, but that should give you a sense of what that is doing. And then I'm in the US, and so I've been waiting for the SEC to release some new rules. In mid 2021, they indicated that they put ESG and climate risk on their rulemaking agenda, and we thought that we would see some announcements at the end of 2021. We still have not seen that. But what we have seen is that in speeches, in requests that they are making of publicly listed companies in the US, they are asking for more clarification on financial filings and asking how they would compare those filings to those companies' sustainability reports. So again, here we have this move to increasingly link financial information with ESG and sustainability performance. We've also seen SEC speeches indicate that that they want to make sure that the information is as relevant as possible to investors, and that's essentially the job of the SEC. There are some other things going on. If you follow U.S. politics, there are all sorts of pressures in terms of getting more information and getting the SEC to move forward. But the SEC moves at its own pace, so I do expect something to come this year, which means that we probably won't see anything put into place until at least 2023. Which is why, if we look at the bottom row here, you do see the expected start date for US SEC ESG and climate rules is not until at least 2023. So I think when I look at that bottom row, I think I've mentioned all of these different elements. SFDR is going to expand. I believe there are 6 different components. And so in addition to those, you see on the right-hand side in the column, GRI and SASB disclosures are going to continue to be the most common form of disclosures for all companies. But that is basically a good start for you to stay on top of the disclosures and the reporting world. All right, so let me take a few minutes to talk about investor grade data. All right, before I get into that, I want to tell you what the biggest problem is that we found in our annual survey in terms of the data. Basically, it's distributed across the organization, and it's hard to bring it together. It's hard to aggregate, and this is something that I'm sure if you've tried to look at what data you have in your corporation, you absolutely understand why this was at the top of our survey for most significant, very significant, and significant responses. We also see some other things that are interesting there, like the executives not really knowing what to move forward with. But really, it's about the fact that the data is not always easy to pull together, and we know that. So I use the term investor grade data for a reason, and we're talking about improving the quality of the data that you have, and that means basic, data hygiene type of things and context. But when we talk about investor grade data, we think of 4 things, and so I have the first 2 on the page here: the accuracy, and is the information auditable? So in terms of accuracy, do I have a process to gather the data, um, the and it's all the quality that the C-suite can use it, and I can assure that the data is accurate. And then in terms of auditability, that's uh, a paper trail. And do I know what formulas I applied? Do I really know what formulas I applied? Because that's sometimes lost in translation. So I caution you on that one. And then the other 2 components: is it time relevant? Uh, and have I automated as much as possible? Because the automation helps with with all of the other attributes that I've defined here. So time relevant. It used to be, I think, that we would expect we'd pull the sustainability data together once a year. That just isn't realistic anymore for a lot of reasons. And then automated. So this will help with knowing that you're collecting it from the right source, the right system of record, and you're eliminating anything manual that contributes to data quality issues. So let me talk about, now you have this data, you're gonna take the time to pull together this data, and so I think to get the most value from the data, we should consider some things. Now, when we asked about sustainability initiatives in our corporate survey, I want to draw your attention to the second response here, which was analyzing climate change to physical assets. So if this is something of interest to you, I want you to know that there are lots of companies that are also going through this process, and recognizing that the physical assets for protecting those assets, for valuing those assets, that it's important to analyze the risk from climate change. So when I think about the investor grade data, we think about who across the organization can make use of that data. And so we have the stakeholder, but we also should think about with what frequency do they need access to that data? What frequency do they need the analysis? And so here I've shared some examples of the decisions that I believe the folks in the C-suite and in the corporate, more senior roles could be making, should be making with this kind of information. So for example, where should we be focusing investments and initiatives? Are we lowering our climate risk or our ESG risk? And then the bottom one, do we have the information for our financial obligations, whether those are about green bonds, or even general bonds and loan obligations. So those are some of the examples at that level. I've also looked at this across a couple different categories. So ESG and sustainability roles specifically. And here you see that the time frame and also some of the examples decisions. Now, one of the most common questions that we seem to be getting is, do we have materiality assessments across scope 1, 2, and 3? And so again, scope 1 is direct emissions from your controlled or your own sources. 2 is indirect emissions from the generation of purchase energy. And scope 3 are emissions from your value chain, whether that's upstream or downstream. And you may have suppliers that you need to ask about their emissions, and that will be part of your scope 3. But also, you may be in a position where you are the scope 3 emissions for your clients, and they're going to want more information about your status and your progress. And so that the expectation for scope 3 emissions data has been escalating, I think, over the last 6 months especially, and over the next year I see that to ramp up even more. Let me just call out another question here that we often see with these roles is the providing information for ad hoc requests from customers. That one seems to be coming up, and that's related to the scope 3 question. And then the final point here, EHS, operations, and other business leaders, I think they have some of the greatest time sensitivity in how frequently they'd like to access that information and see updated information. And I think you would agree with the questions we have here, which are, we want to drive improvements, we want to know about our progress, and we want our employees to be informed on what we're doing and increase engagement. So that is the end of my part of the presentation. As a reminder, please do put questions in the chat. And I'm sure I've gone over my time, Boudewijn, sorry about that, but lots of information and a great topic for today. So thank you.
Thank you. All right, there you go. And everything that Kim said is great, as great background, because it really triggers the question, okay, how can the asset management community help its organizations in kind of this journey, which is a challenging one for sure, but is an important one. And I think I try to summarize everything Kim said in one slide, and this is it. So, obviously, as I said earlier, the organizations are trying to make an impact. And what started off as a reporting obligation, so you could argue that was kind of a lagging indicator, like, after the fact, maybe once a year or whatever, you wind up with an ESG report, and that tells you what you have done over the past year. Very quickly, it's turning into a leading indicator, as Kim was pointing out. Namely, the reporting frequency is increasing, because of that famous question that Kim was just asking, is how are we doing? And should we improve? Where are we lagging? So I think that is really, the key to it all. That is, the reporting is effectively starting to, reporting in the sense of ongoing reporting is starting to affect your strategy and the decision making. So in other words, it's becoming a closed loop where you're improving continuously to make sure that you're actually achieving the goals that you set for yourself as far as ESG impact. Now, this has profound implications within the organization, and in particular, of course, it drives a few key concepts. First of all, you need to kind of get into much more of a long-term planning window. Often the criticism is that companies are driven by quarterly results. Clearly, ESG is not going to work in that context. It is much more of a long-term gain. When you think of, the environment, when you think of social improvements, these are things that take time. So you need to have a long-term plan, and you need to stick with it. So you need the context and the philosophy within your organization and the systems to actually make that work. So we'll come back to that. Secondly, of course, is this issue of alignment, by which you have to align your strategy with your ESG goals. So it could not be a separate initiative. It has to be part of day-to-day decision making. So it has to be part of your strategy, and it has to percolate down to day-to-day decision making. And it's, to some extent, to enforce that, you need the governance in place. In addition to the elements that Kim was mentioning earlier around governance, in the sense that obviously you need to have the processes to report, but you also have to have the processes to make sure that you actually can achieve those goals within your decision-making frameworks, etc. So it has strong implications within the organization. By the way, governance includes risk. Kim, you're quite right. Obviously, risk is a key component to risk management, is a key component to your governance. This is really an important issue, and you can see it. I assume this falls into your uncontrolled category, Kim, of reports, like Climate Action 100, where organizations, the biggest, I was going to say the biggest polluters, that might be a bit exaggerated, but the organizations that can make the biggest impact from an environmental point of view are being rated by this independent organization as to how they're doing compared to their commitments. And invariably, if you look at the rating of any of these large organizations, the area in which they are rated lowest, and in this case it's even red, so it does not meet its own criteria, is the capital allocation alignment. So in other words, lofty goals, but actually in real life, the capital allocation within the organization, so where the funds are being put to work, is not aligned with the ESG goals that the organization has. And this is quite systematic. And I don't think it's by lack of willingness from the organization. It's just largely that the processes and the governance is not in place yet in those organizations to actually make it stick. And that's what we really want to talk about today, of course. And so if I look back at my little diagram that I had at the very beginning of trying to define very quickly what ESG is, what I did here is I kind of shaded in a slightly lighter color the areas in which I think an asset management system, as we understand it within our asset-intensive organizations, cannot affect ESG. So in other words, there's little an asset manager can do about bribery and corruption. Sadly, there's nothing they can do about their executive pay. Otherwise, that would be a fun exercise if I could set my own executive pay. But I can have a big influence as an asset manager, and my asset management system can have a huge influence, of course, on most environmental factors and on many of the social factors. So in other words, if I have a good asset management system in place, I can actually help my organization along quite significantly. So let's see how this works. If you think of the way that within an organization we set objectives for different departments, different teams, obviously they're driven by the internal strategy of the organization, which comes from the top, from the CEO or from the board. But as an asset-intensive organization, a big part of that strategy is mitigated or is influenced by the fact that I own assets, physical assets. And those assets are risky, as we discussed earlier. And consequently, just because they degrade or because of climate change or because of any number of other reasons, these risks become such that I have to spend money to keep the assets going and to keep them safe. So that is going to influence my objectives in a big way, because it has nothing to do with the aspirations of the CEO growth or anything like that. It's just to stay in business. A big part of my objectives, a big part of my resources will have to go to maintaining my assets in good shape. Equally, regulators tend to be all over us, write rules as to what needs to happen. Could be safety rules, environmental rules, economic rules. So those will influence my objectives in a big way, of course. And increasingly, stakeholders, outside stakeholders, or even internal stakeholders can also influence my objectives. And they, of course, are looking at this through their own lenses. And I call that here value, because every stakeholder will have his own lens as to what is important and what is not. And the aggregate of that, you could argue, is the value that they're trying to extract from the organization or receive from the organization. Now, we could argue that ESG primarily drives the rules that the regulators might be writing, as Kim was pointing out, and the fact that stakeholders have their own view of environmental, social, and possibly even governance factors that they are pushing on the organization too. So in other words, very simplistically, the environment in which we operate as an organization is becoming more complex, and there's more and more pressure points being put on our objective setting, because our strategy has to evolve to include all these different elements that are being imposed on the organization, basically, either by the assets or by the outside world. So the key is value. We need to have some kind of a definition of value which is broad enough that allows us to accommodate all these different factors that we've seen here. And it becomes a bit of a mind bender. That's the image on the right there, in the sense that historically, my goal as a C-level executive was be profitable. Well, that's simple enough. I can do that. I need a spreadsheet and I'll figure it out. Now, my goal is way more complex. I have all these conflicting demands coming from different angles, which make my decision-making much more complex. And with that, the need for processes and potentially systems to actually help me along in this journey. And the number one element is presumably the need for a value framework. In other words, I need a rational and very systematic way of capturing all those value elements that I just described, coming from different angles, building a framework around that I can use to actually value every single intervention or every single decision that I'm going to make within the organization. So in other words, if the idea is, okay, well, we're going to refurbish, this particular asset, well, of course, that's going to reduce its risk. And we all understand that. And we might even turn it into dollars or into euros to help us kind of quantify it. But there might be other factors that are helped by that particular intervention that I'm planning, right? And hence, I need to spell out everything that the organization wants to achieve in a value framework so that this gives me effectively the menu of items that I can go and tick off for my particular project now to say, like, well, this particular project contributes to A, B, C, D. So this is a fictional framework, of course, that I just kind of cooked up, where you can see the 5 big strategic objectives of the organization, reliable service, affordable service, etc. And every one of them has a number of metrics by which I can actually define how I'm contributing to those specific strategic objectives. So in my little fictional example here, what I have is a particular project which contributes to 5 metrics that I found in my framework. And now all those metrics might not have the same weight to the organization. So for instance, I might actually value cost savings higher than I do employee wellness. Sorry, it's the way it is in my fictional company. And therefore, my overall value is the sum of the metrics multiplied by their weights, and very simplistically, and that gives me a total value of this particular project. And of course, that value changes over time. If I defer a project, the value tomorrow might not be the value today for any number of reasons, both financial, but also, of course, the fact that the world changes on me all the time. So it is important to understand the time factor in this little game. So that's conceptually how you could actually kind of start expressing value, including ESG factors and potentially many ESG factors. We at Copperleaf, we have a couple of clients, especially in Europe, it will come as no surprise, where the number of value metrics in their value frameworks is in the hundreds. And that actually comes from the outside world. These are the pressure points that are being put on the organization by the outside world, which drive the complexity of the value frameworks, which also means that without a value framework, you'd pretty much be lost because it would be impossible to manage them all. So then, of course, we have to apply this. And for that, we'll go to what we would call decision analytics in the context of an asset-intensive business. In other words, what we call asset investment planning. And there's really 3 time horizons. So the long-term one, which we mentioned earlier, is the fact that you have to predict what's coming at you. And in particular, of course, in an asset-intensive organization, predict what the assets might well need over time as far as future investment or future attention. So the long-term component is key. You need to model the future. You need to be able to prepare for it, both prepare financially, but also resource-wise, etc., so that you're not caught unawares. Secondly, you have the fact that you need to align your decisions with your strategic objectives. And for that, we use a value framework, as I just saw. You use that value framework to basically value every one of the projects that you're putting forward, but then you still have potentially too many projects compared to the resources, both financial and otherwise, that you have available. So you need to pick. And in order to pick smartly, you really need a portfolio optimization mechanism by which you put your project in competition. They are ranked by value, of course, but it's not a simple ranking. You can actually, using proper optimization algorithms, really start kind of effectively, robbing Peter to pay Paul, but in a smart way to optimize the use of your funds and resources and achieve the maximum results. In particular, of course, in line with the constraints that you have, constraints as to ESG objectives that you have to achieve, risk tolerances, financial limits, etc. And then if you make a plan, sadly, most plans go sideways for any number of reasons. So you need a governance framework, which actually manages the plan for you and makes sure that you actually achieve what you promised you were going to achieve, so that when you report on it, it actually holds water. So the management aspect is effectively the high frequency control of everything else that's going on within the organization as far as execution of your plans, to make sure that you actually do achieve your plans as promised. Now, the good thing is that asset management as a discipline has been ahead of the game in a way. As you know, there is a overcoupling kind of standard, which is called ISO 55000. That was released, I think, something like 7 years ago now, if my memory serves me well. And a lot of the principles in there align extremely well with what ESG needs today. And that's why I said that asset management can really help within the context of achieving your ESG goals. Is the framework is there, the tools are there, because we've been working at this for years now. So you can actually come up with a very nice value-based and risk-informed decision-making framework, as I say here, which is completely transparent, has good governance, and it is based on the principles ISO 55000. So that's the beauty of it all. And the reason this is important is because when you think of it in an organization, typically you have hundreds of projects on the go, or that are being put forward as suggestions of things that should happen in the organization. And at the same time, you have any number of constraints. I just picked a few on the left there for fun. And of course, the normal way of doing things in many organizations is look at the financial constraints, say, okay, guys, our financial targets are as such over the next few years. So we're just going to squeeze, everything we can under the budget, and everything else we'll deal with later. Relatively easy. I can do this in a spreadsheet. But if, of course, I'm at the same time trying to manage the total risk that I want to be exposed to, that might be a different choice of projects and a different profile. And if I'm looking at the resources that I have as far as people and equipment, that might have a maximum, as in the maximum amount of people that I can use at any point in time, but also there might be a minimum, because I don't want my people to be underutilized. So this is even a more complex constraints that I have to adhere to at the same time, which drives me to different conclusions again. And then I might have others, like, in this particular case, I have outages here, but I also have my renewable targets. I might have other ESG targets. So there's any number of targets or constraints, as I said, it could be in the hundreds, that apply at any point in time with the organization. So if you mix them all up, come up with the right answer is actually a crazy mind bender. You really need a system to help you, and good math to help you come to the optimal decision, considering all these constraints. Otherwise, you're essentially leaving money on the table. And that's something which, in the current economic climate, is something you really don't want to do. Interestingly, it does come with side effects, in particular the fact that even from the formal point of view, as Kim was pointing out, we're starting to do real accounting here. It's not only a matter of accounting on the financial side, there's other things that we can start really accounting for. For instance, in this case, we're dealing also with the cost of carbon and with the cost of water. So in other words, you really start getting into systems by which your decision making is driven by both relatively soft targets, if you wish, but also extremely hard accountable elements which are now being part of the decision-making framework and show up in your decision-making systems, as you can see on this little screenshot here. So it really kind of drives us to a multi-criteria decision analysis problem for which you need the appropriate decision-making solutions within your organization. So therefore, very quickly on my side, quick summary is obviously you need to align your decision-making with your ESG objectives. That means ideally a value framework. A value framework can actually be built from scratch, but very often is actually driven, of course, by libraries of existing value models that come from other peer organizations, and you can just get inspired by them. The fact that you need very strong governance, I think we've beaten that one to death, and the fact that clearly your ESG targets must be part of your long-term planning because it is a long-term game. And therefore, you need a system to enforce those long-term plans. The fact that, yes, you need to kind of create a plan to both mitigate your risk and achieve your aspirational ESG goals, which really means that you need some kind of a optimization tool to make sure that you're actually getting the highest value possible from your limited resources. And the fact that you might need to work on different scenarios because the future is uncertain. We all know that. In the last 2 years, I've served that up, copiously to us. So the future is very uncertain. You need the ability to kind of work on different scenarios. What if the world turns out this way? What do I do? What if it turns out differently? Which brings us to agility, because there is unforeseen events all the time, as we all know. And therefore, despite that, you need to kind of achieve your commitments. So you need this agility, which means that you need systems to very quickly allow you to change tack and adjust to the new reality. Stop projects, move projects, refinance, whatever. And all this in a very financially and governance transparent way, because obviously the outside world is starting to ask questions more and more pointedly, as Kim was noting. So it has to be data driven. There has to be a very clear way of understanding how the organization makes decisions, and are these decisions aligned with their strategic objectives, and therefore that in turn, of course, kind of supports the ESG reporting with the relevant data. So that was my little contribution. Now I think we're going to open it to questions, and therefore I'll go back to Zara.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing all of that. I feel like this is something we could talk about for hours and hours, but we did get some questions in, so let's get cracking on those. So first one is, what typical asset management objectives and metrics should, I think that's the key word there, should be defined and measured pertaining to ESG? And I know, Boudewijn, I can tell by your face, that's a tricky one.
No?
It's
a good one. It's just tricky because it's early in the morning here. I've only had one coffee, so I'm going to have to remember them all. But it's a good one. And if you think of it, as I said, I think asset management can contribute hugely to many of the factors that you typically find in ESG frameworks. And the obvious ones that come to mind are things like, environmental. A lot of our projects and a lot of our assets present environmental risks. Projects can mitigate those risks or prevent those risks. Wildfire is one that comes to mind right away. Like there's a lot of discussion right now as to, how do we harden our assets for wildfires? But that's in particular areas of the world. Flooding is just equally important. So you could say that sits in between environmental and your general reliability, of course. But you can see where I'm going with that. The classic one, of course, is avoided carbon emissions. So carbon accounting, as I was just showing in the last slide there, that's something which most organizations are starting to do in earnest. And of course, your choices as you invest in your assets can make a big difference there as far as carbon accounting goes. But water is in there. On the softer side, when you think of social, of course, just think of the work environment, like simple things like noise. Can make a big difference. So there's companies that literally are kind of looking at that. What's the noise kind of footprint of my assets going forward? Visual impact. There's whole studies that have been done on, for instance, transmission towers are a classic example for electricity. It's like, are they ugly, or are they kind of interesting, or are they just not there because we've buried the lines? So you could argue that makes a big impact on the environment.
Can I want to just jump in for a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, basically, what should be defined and measured pertaining to ESG? Every single operational metric you have, every single one. I mean, that's just the reality of what we're facing. So you need to consider from the different elements that Boudewijn talked about, the value creation, the impact driven, the risk piece. All of it's going to come into play for ESG. And what you have to do is go through and decide, how material are they, and do the ranking. I think, Boudewijn, you did a really nice job of kind of the thought process for what's most important. How do we make decisions? But every single one of those operational metrics is going to be relevant to ESG. It's just how much, how important is it?
Exactly. And which will be different by country and by company, of course.
Absolutely. So there's also a follow-up there on that. So I think, Boudewijn, this is going to start off with you on this one as well with your ISO work, but are the current asset management standards, for example, 55001, and requirements on asset management maturity, for example, GFAM 39 subjects, adequate to meet the current drives on ESG and mandatory disclosure? If yes, please elaborate. And if not, what changes do you think should be made to these standards?
So, I mean, the short answer is they're on their way. Like as I said, my personal belief is that the asset management community with the ISO did a phenomenal job of seeing this coming. So the 55,000 standard was one of the first that actually even addressed the concepts, not in words. It didn't say ESG in as many words, but a lot of the concepts are in there. And in particular, the concept of value, the fact that you're actually going for this broader concept of value, as opposed to just meeting financial objectives and possibly safety objectives, right? So that was there from day one. This being said, 55,001, which is the normative standard, is currently under review. And one of the reasons for that is the fact that we want to introduce more thinking along the lines of ESG. There's other factors, of course. I mean, like, it's a plan, do, check, act kind of permanent loop, right? Like you have to keep improving, and that's true for the standards too. As you mentioned, Kim, at the very beginning, sorry, not Kim, Zara, at the very beginning, you mentioned that I was part of the strategic advisory group at ISO. This is true. It's also quite painful because they tend to meet at 3 a.m. for me every single time. Thank you very much, guys. But it's important because it means that ISO is recognizing the fact that it's not an asset management problem only. It applies across your whole management system. So quality, environmental, safety, you name it. All these management systems should talk the same language and be ESG infused, if you wish. So that's something which is underway. And it'll take its sweet time, of course, because there's literally hundreds of standards that have to be adjusted or kind of rethought in that context. So that's number 2. Number 3 is it will never, I don't think, become the regulation. ISO doesn't regulate. ISO, gives you best practices that you can adhere to. The regulation component is what Kim described, and that will be driven by different bodies like ISSB in particular, I think, which will come up with, hopefully a universal standard for reporting.
Thank you. We've got a couple more minutes here before we have to wrap up. There's a couple questions I'd love to get to. So I think you sort of touched on this in slides. I think the question came in before your slides, but if you want to just touch on it again, could you please elaborate on some of the assets that are to be considered in asset management, specifically not limited to assets of the corporation, such as equipment, etc.?
That question was for, sorry, Zara?
Sorry?
Who are you asking that question?
I think it's for you, Boudewijn. But
okay.
I think it's for you first.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, the asset, it's an interesting point. I mean, obviously, we come at it, Copperleaf, we love asset-intensive organizations, so we think asset as in physical assets first and foremost. But clearly, ESG, if anything, the word says it's social is in there. So there is a big component which is, goes beyond physical assets. It definitely includes the people assets. And you could argue there's also intangible assets within the organization which need to be managed just as well. So in that regard, I think ESG is a bit of a kind of opener, it opens your mind to the fact that your decisions have this much broader spectrum of what they impact, and therefore also how they are being made within the organization. Clearly, at any point in time in an organization, if I bring a project to the table where I want to improve my physical asset A, I'm in competition with HR, which came up with a project where it wants to improve the well-being of the employees. And we're fighting for the same money pot eventually, right? So clearly you need a framework which allows you to kind of weigh the relative benefits of any project within the organization or any use of funds within the organization. And whatever brings the highest value to the organization should be, funded first.
Kim, did you want to jump in on that, or is that pretty much summarize what you were thinking?
I think that's good for now. Yeah.
Okay, great. So let's tackle this last one and see where we land on time. I think, again, it was a really lovely segue you did there, Boudewijn, on this. So can you talk a little bit about ranking non-financial values against financial values? So would you recommend an equivalent risk approach versus a straight up financial quantification based on willingness to pay?
Wow. Yes. The answer is yes. No. So basically, it's an interesting question, and it nearly becomes philosophical, right? Like some organizations are a bit more hard-nosed in that regard, and will actually say, you know what, at the end of the day, whatever the problem is, we're going to have to put money against it. Consequently, anything should be monetized, because fundamentally we're going to spend money on it. So, and we'll only spend as much money as it's worth to us. So inherently, we're monetizing everything. Other organizations might be very uncomfortable with that approach, or might be driven by legal considerations not to make this too apparent. So in other words, if you put a money value to every risk, it also kind of implies that if that risk happens, you can be sued at the very least for that amount of money that you published. If you want to avoid that, you might have an internal non-monetary scale, but still a uniform scale across the whole organization that allows you to value everything on this internal secret scale, if you wish. And then like somebody somewhere in the organization has a key to the secret vault, which actually contains the conversion code from internal scale to actual dollars or actual euros. So it really depends on how you want to play it. But the fundamental rule, I think, always is you have to have a rigorous and consistent way of valuing everything against one scale. Otherwise, you're diluting yourself, right?
I basically think the simple response to that is money makes the world go round. And we find that that's true even in the most philanthropic organizations and agencies and companies, that ultimately they need money to succeed. So the other aspect, I think, is that this is what's changing. The financial value we place on non-financial assets, properties, this is what sustainable finance is about, is a change in how we financially value things. And even if you, so I mean, that's the short answer. I know we're running out of time. You have to have some way to quantify the risk, which relates to financial value, some way to quantify the opportunity that relates to financial value, right? So the impact, same thing. So you need these to support the decision making in your organization.
True. And the more so that's what your investors are going to expect from you. I mean, your investors don't want a good story. They want to see the facts. So it's going to have to be numbers.
Guys, it's almost like you planned the timing on that one. So once again, a huge thank you. We are pretty much at time. And just to quickly wrap things up here, thank you, Kim and Boudewijn, for joining us and sharing with us. And for those of you on the session, if you would like to connect directly with Boudewijn or Kim, their contact information is there. And as we said in the chat, and I said earlier, we're going to be sharing the recording very, very soon with you all, as well as the slide deck for those that would like it. We will give you information. We will give you information within about 24 hours or so. So to wrap things up, thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope you have a wonderful rest of the day and look forward to seeing you at the next one. Bye-bye.
Bye now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.